On behalf of the Ancient Tree Forum, welcome to another webinar in the series covering the VetCert standard at practicing level. This session covers Unit 4, which is about veteran trees as ecosystems. Please remember to make a note of any questions as you go along, which can be picked up at the live Q&A sessions. So Unit 4, Veteran Trees as Ecosystem, is divided into two subsections. Describe the wide range of ecological values of veteran trees and how they fit into the wider context and ecosystems, and that you need to be able to identify veteran tree habitats in situ, actually on the trees in the field. So first, we pick up number 1 about describing the wide range of values. So the first element to that is showing awareness of the importance for biodiversity of abundant, good quality veteran tree habitat continuously present for centuries. That the point here that veteran trees contain high quality habitat and it's stable over time. An individual tree can have a huge range of different sorts of niches or habitats for other species. And the actual trees themselves are what we would call a keystone species. So this is the level of awareness that you would be expected to understand, and that the species associated with them have developed over many, many thousands of years, which also suggests that veteran trees were much more common. And species can survive because of the stability, but that when you don't have lots of trees or where they're isolated and fragmented, that can result in species loss if that tree were to fall over or be felled or set fire to, for example. So a single hollow can provide, for example, a home to 10 to 20 different species. And that's one of the problems that we have, is that we don't always know all the species that are in a single individual tree. So that's something you need to show an awareness of. Then also in relation to this too, the awareness of the importance of the distribution of veteran trees in the landscape and the mobility of the organism. So I've already mentioned that if you have isolated sites, then species are very vulnerable. Because of the fact we think that the species, that veteran trees were probably much more common in the landscape, which meant that species didn't have to travel far in order to find another suitable tree. So you need to have succession on a site. You need to have other trees with suitable potential habitat nearby, and that reflects in relation to the mobility of the species that are associated with our veteran trees. So we know, for example, that beetle species, there are some of them that don't really travel very far most often, and that means that you would need to have another suitable tree within, say, 500 metres of the existing one to ensure that that's got habitat in the future. But one wouldn't be enough, because that one might not be just quite right. In relation to larger species that have better dispersal mechanisms, or in relation to fungi, then we know they can travel much further. But generally speaking, understanding that connection, or at least being able to show an awareness of an understanding of the fact that having lots of veteran trees in the landscape is very important for the species associated. You need to be able to demonstrate an understanding of how an individual veteran tree sits within a wider ecosystem, and recognise that these processes are linked. So that the fact, as I've just mentioned, individual veteran trees can have a different range of habitats, and the fact that a particular beetle is found in one, let's say, hollow oak tree, doesn't mean that it will be found in the one next door. And that's possibly because of a whole range of factors that we don't always understand. So it could be the fungi that's breaking down the heartwood, that's creating different conditions. It could be the temperature, the climate, the exposure. All of those things have an impact on the appropriateness of the species. So they can be impacted by, for example, management. So if there's trees that are pollarded, that will make a difference. That also, it's not just the trees that are important too, that many of the species, particularly the invertebrate species that are found in old trees, also require nectar and pollen to be able to fly and be able to reproduce. So it's very important that, green woodpeckers, as an example, require tree hollows to nest in, but they also need ants' nests to feed on. So they require open areas relatively nearby. Though it's understanding in arboriculture, I guess, that you're very often focusing on the individual tree, but understanding that each individual veteran tree is part of something much, much bigger. and thus the impact of your work potentially has an impact on a wider scale. And you need to show an awareness of the complexity and diversity of habitats that veteran trees can provide. And we've touched on this already, but that individual trees can have a completely different range of species associated with them. And that may be dependent on the tree species, of course, but it may be more dependent on the fungal species that are decaying, the heartwood, for example, be dependent on the management history and how that's changed over time, and the individual species requirements. So, this is beefsteak fungus, Fistulina hepatica, and that's associated with oak and is a heart rotter of oak and creates the brown rot decay, which in turn is important for specific species. Then we would expect you as a practitioner to be able to identify veteran tree habitats in situ. And this one is obviously an ash tree with fantastic hollowing and decay inside the main trunk. But we would expect you to be able to identify a range of potential microhabitats. And by microhabitats, we mean small hollows or cracks, or these are what we would call microhabitats that are associated with veteran trees, and demonstrate that you understand what species might make use of these particular habitats. So this is your applied knowledge. So let's say, for example, that we could say a hollow, and that's a microhabitat, and that you would be able to demonstrate what species might be dependent upon that hollow. So birds, insects, fungi, so on. We don't expect you to be able to identify to species level what we're talking about, but we certainly would expect you to have an understanding of the range of organisms that would be dependent upon these particular microhabitats. And this is the example from the book, David Lonsdale's book, where illustrating all the different sorts of microhabitats that could be found on a single tree and what species might make use of those. So that's something to study if it's an area you feel not as confident in. We would also expect you to be able to recognise decaying wood of different types and the stages of decay. So we would expect you to be able to recognise brown rot from white rot, and we would expect you to be able to identify wood mould, and that being a later stage of decay in comparison to the first two. And that's something you would have to do in the field. And we need you also to kind of a sense of what are the different features of those decay types. And that's something that, not in a huge amount of depth or detail, but at least so that you can recognise and explain what the differences are between those different types of decay. And here again are a few resources for you if this is an area you feel like you'd need to read up a bit more about. There's a chapter 7 in Helen's book about management of veteran trees for other organisms is very useful. And chapter 5, habitat quality and continuity in wood, pasture, parkland, orchards and hedgerows in David Lonsdale's book. And again, they're both available to download or purchase. Then there's a wonderful book that was produced in 2012, which brings together all the information we have about biodiversity in deadwood. And that covers the whole range of different species if you really want to dive into this subject a bit more. There's also some fact sheets which are specifically for VetCert potential specialists, where there's a summary overview of the different species groups or guilds as we call them, and what sorts of habitat requirements they might have, and particularly looking at what implication that might have for management, because that's obviously the important part for practitioners. There's also an ancient tree guide about the special wildlife of trees, which is more of a kind of nice overview of the different sorts of wildlife you find associated with ancient and veteran trees. And then there's a range of videos, VetCert videos, looking at the different types of wood decay, introducing heart rot and hollowing, and then heart rot and hollowing of beech and oak, being two of the species that have a large range of species associated with them in turn. So next time we'll cover 2 units within the same webinar, and we'll look at Unit 5 and Unit 6, which is veteran trees and their value for people and their cultural history values. So see you next time. Thank you.